folks, thanks for joining us here at SFuels. What a weekend. The Tour de France first stage kicks off today there in Europe, and then right now, real time, of course, we've got the Western States going on, the Ultra. They're already down into the gullies and cruising across the race course, the men and the women. And next week we go into Challenge Roth, of course, also in Germany. Looking forward to seeing Sven Toes there for the SFuels team competing. We had a bunch of athletes at the T100 in San Francisco, multiple 70.3s and Ironmans across the world, including Mont Tremblant. What a wet race last weekend. And it's just a crazy period of racing all around the world. Well, today we wanted to share some of the questions coming into the support inbox. We think that many athletes will be interested in these questions that our athletes are raising around the world, and we'll jump into them. There's 4 questions that have come up that we chose that we thought would be interesting for all. The first is around over-consuming caffeine pre-race and also too much early in an ultra marathon. Is that something that can be? How do we deal with it? We'll jump into that question. Second one was, what's the difference between maltodextrin and highly branched cyclic dextrin and glucose? We're going to cover that. The third was around, why take carbohydrates and 100milers when it's all in zone 2? And, I'll jump to it in a second, but they're certainly not in zone 2 all the way through an ultra, and we'll talk more about that. And the final question, which has raised a ton of interest, is athletes across the world start using the SFuels second generation zone 2 and zone 4 products in training. They're noticing much less delayed onset muscle soreness than they had when they were either using a totally different product or they were even using our first generation SFuels Train and Race Plus products. What's the difference? So we'll jump into that. Let's dive into it with this first question. Okay, so the first question is, can we overconsume caffeine pre-race or early within an ultra marathon? And to simply get straight to the answer is yes. The issue here, of course, is the jitters or the kind of hyperexcitability or even a heart flutter that can happen in caffeine sensitive. And you can train this. The more you use it, the less effect. But let's get back to the guidance of dosage is really important here, and how you use caffeine is important to mitigate this issue. It doesn't really need to be an issue at all, and it's highly manageable. So the pre-race guidance of use of caffeine for the purposes of cognitive focus and confidence leading into a race is around 0.5 to 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight. So firstly, do your math on that. From a new athlete that's coming into the sport, it's very common, of course, that when they think caffeine to immediately jump to coffee and tea, and there's nothing wrong with coffee and tea. However, in the spirit of really tuning the use of caffeine in a pre-race context or even during a race, we really want to understand the amount that we're using. And the challenge with coffee and tea is that depending upon the tea that's used and the bean that's used and the way it's prepared and brewed, etc., there can be a 300% difference in the caffeine amount. And you think you're taking a certain amount, and it can be wildly different. And that's a problem, of course, if you're trying to manage the benefit versus some of these kind of temporary issues around hyperexcitability and the jitters, etc. Now, the other side of this is when we create a product with a measured dose of caffeine, that's one way to actually reduce and mitigate this risk by knowing how much is in a given drink that you're taking prior to the race, that 0.5 to 1 milligram per kilogram body weight. You can do that with a measured dose. In the primed sachet, there's 80 milligrams per sachet. So you can do the math with that for yourself. But the other aspect here is, beside caffeine, is that we've attached taurine, another amino acid, and taurine is a neuromodulator. So whereas caffeine is upregulating that cognitive focus, taurine is actually moderating the excitability of cell membranes, neuronal membranes, etc. So you want the cognitive tone, but you want that modulation effect to really avoid those jitters. So we put 1 gram of taurine into that prime formula for that purpose. Now, reality is, of course, too, when you start the race and you get into the physical exercise and the movement, that muscle contraction and the movement of blood to the muscles, the shunting of blood around the body, a lot of that, if you will, excitability and jitter issue will immediately dissolve. It's very, very rapidly will dissolve. Once you're started, we actually want to then increase the use of caffeine and carnitine for upregulating fat oxidation and also reducing the rate of perceived exertion. And that dosage is around 2 to 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. And you want to maintain that kind of dosage every 6 hours. At that point, around 6 hours, you'll find that your caffeine has reached that half-life. So you want to use another hit of that relative to the duration of your race. So let's talk about then using, if you will, too much caffeine in the front end of a race, particularly ultra marathons, which can be, 12 hours, 20 hours, 24, 40 hours, etc. The risk, of course, with using too much up front is that you can get a little overzealous and overconfident in the front half of the race, and your head gets more confident than your legs, and you'll pay for this, of course, in the second half of the race. And generally, of course, we want to use caffeine in ultras, firstly, from somewhere in the middle of the race onwards. We also want to use it when we go through night periods for, again, cognitive focus. We don't want to trip and this type of things. Caffeine will help us to have, far greater focus and confidence through the night. Technical parts or high parts where you've got rapid elevation change and you really want to manage that rate of perceived exertion. This is the good use of caffeine, but leave it till a little later in the race so that you don't overextend yourself in the first half of the race. So hopefully that helps with the use of caffeine. Let's jump to the second question. Okay, so this second question, it's really an ingredient question. It's really around what's the difference between these two starches, highly branched cyclic dextrin and maltodextrin. And you'll see these in our zone 4, and you'll see the maltodextrin in our zone 5 products. Now, both of these are complex starches, meaning they're a polysaccharide. They're a long chain of glucose molecules, only glucose. And, conversely, say glucose is just a monosaccharide, a single saccharide. These starches, both maltodextrin and the highly branched cyclic dextrin, they're not that sweet. They're water soluble. And I'll get into the difference in a second to an extra step that, goes from maltodextrin to highly branched cyclic dextrin. Before I do, though, I want to talk about this starches versus glucose. And this is really important for endurance athletes to understand that when you see a product with glucose in it, you're going to have issues because it's very slow moving through the gut into the small intestine. It'll sit in the gut, wash around. And the reason for that, it has a very high osmolality. And what does that mean? And just by high, just as context, it can be 20 to 30 times higher than starch. And that high osmolality means that it basically sits in the gut much longer as opposed to being absorbed and moving down into the small intestine. So the starches have a low osmolality, and that means that osmosis can move much quicker through the membrane and come through the gut, I should say, and then be absorbed in the small intestine much faster. And, in some of the studies, it's like, this is not about like a minute difference. This can be 20 minutes difference between glucose and these types of starches. And fructose is not that much better than glucose. So when you talk about then the difference between maltodextrin and highly branched cyclic dextrin, what they're doing is applying a further enzyme treatment that branches the starch. And that branching even further lowers the osmolality. And by further lowering it, it means that it further speeds up the way that starch moves out of the gut and through into the small intestine. It's not a lot faster compared to maltodextrin, but it's a little faster. There is a higher cost because of the patent of that enzyme treatment. So what we've done in the SFuels products, we firstly avoid the use of any of the monosaccharides, glucose. We don't use that. And really what we're trying to do there is avoid that slow gut movement. We really want, when we're using these carbohydrates, when we need those carbohydrates, we want it to move through the gut fast to avoid the gut issues. And we want to get access to the benefit, of course, to the carbohydrate and get it out into the blood as quick as we can. And in the Zone 4 product, we use both maltodextrin and highly branched cyclic dextrin as a mix. And then in the Zone 5 product, we've just got the maltodextrin. So, and also fructose. So this is the difference between the two. There's not a dramatic difference between them except for this branching effect that that enzyme treatment does. But the key point to take away is that we're not using glucose to slow down the movement of that carbohydrate starch through the gut into the small intestine to get it rapidly absorbed. Okay, let's move on to the first one. Okay, this third question is really about ultras or very extended endurance racing, think 100-milers, etc. The question came up from one of the retailers actually on, hey, isn't most of these ultras run at Zone 2, so why do you need to take carbohydrate at all? Well, don't be mistaken, these ultras are not at all at just Zone 2. Even though they are slower, they still come in and out of Zone 3, 4, and 5 for a lot of reasons. It could be elevation change, it could be technical, it could be just competitive, if you will, surges. And what you will find in all of this endurance racing, not just in ultras, but you will find there's a cardiac drift whereby even at a certain intensity, you'll start to see your heart rate raising even at an intensity which typically in shorter training sessions, you wouldn't see these higher heart rates at a lower intensity, but you will when these types of events go on for so long. The other aspect of this, though, is that if you even look at lab data for a classic substrate test, a VO2 max and substrate test, you will see that even at very low intensities, that there is still carbohydrate being utilized. And it may be a very small amount, and certainly you can train this whereby more and more fat is used at higher intensities. But even for, a very entry-level athlete, you will see that there is still a little bit of carbohydrate being used. Well, these ultra runs, 100-milers and what have you, these get 12, 20, 40 hours, etc., long in duration, and you clearly are going to exhaust that liver and muscle glycogen in the process. So you absolutely need to take carbohydrate through these extended endurance racing events like ultras, and anywhere between 30 and 60 grams per hour is recommended. And I'll put in the back half of this video just the links to our race guides and training guides. Everyone is going to be different relative to your fat oxidation efficiency and also the intensity that you're going to be actually racing the ultra at. What is common that in addition to just good sound nutrition in the way of, carbohydrate loaded drinks and gels, in addition for ultra running, taking on whole foods and high sodium beverages like soups and what have you, is really going to support well your consistency of performance through an ultra because of just the extended nature and the demands it's placing on the body. So hopefully that helps. Let's jump on to the final and fourth question, which is a really interesting one. Okay, so the fourth question, this is really an interesting one, and it's a question as much as a comment that we've had from a number of athletes beginning to use our Zone 2 and Zone 4 products. And it's an observation that they're making, and we're not surprised that this comes about. And the observation is that why is it that on using the Zone 2, Zone 4 product in training, that where in times past they would have had some level of delayed onset muscle soreness, they no longer are having that with these products. And of course, this is valuable in the spirit of being able to consistently line up, very large training blocks and consistent day-to-day high volume training. The answer to it in its simplest fashion is the use of this extended substrate. I'm going to talk to you why it's the case. But this is really through that technology enabling a what we would term a clinical dose of glutamine very efficiently. By efficiently, meaning efficiently be able to package it into a product and be facilitating high absorption. And we do that through attaching the glutamine to the C8, C10 medium chain triglycerides. Now, just to give you context here, of if you compare, because the observations and the questions have come from athletes that are new to SFuels and also athletes that have used our first generation products. And the reason why the observations coming about that if you look at other products, there's either zero glutamine, or in our first generation SFuels Train product and our Race Plus product, there was only 500 milligrams of glutamine in those formulas. In a clinical setting, you really want to be higher than that. And to achieve that is why we had to create and work out how to develop and manufacture this extended substrate. Because if I use the comparison of SFuels Train and compare it to the second generation Zone 2 fueling product, there's 8 times the glutamine per single dose. So rather than 500 milligrams, there's now 4 grams in SFuels Zone 2. In what was Race Plus and now SFuels Zone 4, there is 4 times the dosage. And the reason it's 4 for a single serve is typically in a race environment, we would double dose, meaning 2 serves per hour. And that would get also to the 4 grams per hour or per usage. So these types of levels are then very clinical. And what is happening in delayed onset muscle soreness? Well, there are actually still evolving views on the method by which that soreness comes about. But at the end of the day, the debate is more over the order and the method by which this inflammation happens. But the eccentric muscle contraction ultimately leads to attracting an immune inflammatory response. And, there are multiple markers, if you will, of inflammatory response. But I guess 2 that consistently get used as both a measure for inflammation and also a measure for understanding how different either treatments, whether that is simple massage or a bath, hot bath, or nutrition, can modulate that inflammation, that over-inflammatory response. And some of those markers are, creatine kinase, some of the C-reactive protein. And what you'll find in the studies is that both of these, through the dosage of glutamine that we're talking about, can modulate them down. That's what's facilitating this ability to recover very rapidly and wake up the next morning and do it all again. C-reactive protein it's in the plasma. It's produced by the liver. It responds to a cytokine from one of the white blood cells, a macrophage. That cytokine is interleukin 6, and when that rises, it triggers the C-reactive protein. And those macrophages, the job of it is to mop up, if you will, the debris of foreign substances that come about through the injury or through an infection or through mechanical effectively damage. And that's what these eccentric muscle contractions are doing. And multiple random control trials have shown that you can significantly reduce that C-reactive protein via glutamine. The same for creatine kinase. In fact, a really interesting study and there's multiple of them, but one of them that I picked out was around the basketball, and very classically known for, because of just a lot of that rapid start stop, a lot of eccentric muscle contractions. So delayed onset muscle soreness is a common thing with that type of exercise, and they measured creatine kinase as a measure for muscle damage, and they showed that in the group that was prescribed glutamine versus placebo, that creatine kinase level was much lower. The inflammation in the DOMS was much lower. So this is the benefit of using the Zone 2 and Zone 4 products in training, in that you're not only fueling the muscles, but really facilitating and manage that hyper-inflammatory response, so that you can really take on the metabolic benefit of training and the gains from a aerobic capacity, building out mitochondrial density, improving obviously aerobic and also carbohydrate oxidation and fat oxidation. But we want to do that while really modulating the inflammation, so that you can line up the next day and do it again. That's what's going to have you the consistent gains day to day, week to week in training. That's a reason why we're using the Zone 2, Zone 4 products. Hopefully that's helpful to your training. And I know there's a ton of racing going on all around the world. I wish you all the very best. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to send it our way at support@sfuelsgolonger.com. And also, I'll just leave you here with the links to our training and racing guides, and that can help you how to apply some of these nutrition products to your training to maximize the benefit and improve your performance. Hope you have a great week. All the very best, and as usual,